Good morning and welcome back. We're now talking about this theme that I have referred to as the secret of life as being defiance. And one of the main messages there is this notion that through the consumption of energy, it's possible to contravene the inevitable increase of entropy and decay. I don't want to get too qualitative. In fact, au contraire, I want to be quite concrete. So, as a prelude to the many case studies that we'll do, case studies such as thinking about how polymer polymerization is done in a high fidelity way, or how biological systems perform adaptation, or how even something straightforward like weight is lifted because a molecular motor marches along a filament. All of these are examples where energy has to be consumed. And what I want to talk about is in a semi careful way is this idea of biological batteries. So again, we're going to do some case studies in this topic using these kinds of biological batteries, but for the moment I want to talk about what the biological batteries are. And so the first point that I want to make is that a battery as is the outlet that my computer is plugged into. They're an energy source that is kind of universal. In other words, I can use a battery for a smoke detector in a bedroom. I can use a battery for the headlamp that I use on my bike. I can use it for um, an iPhone. A battery can be used for many, many different purposes. And the idea is that somewhere else, somewhere over there, somebody has constructed an object which harbors this stored energy. And we don't concern ourselves with that. I mean, sure, we go to the store and we have to buy it, or alternatively, we pay the electric company for the plug that we stick in. But really, the battery or the electrical outlet with 110 volts is there, and there's a myriad of different ways that energy can be used. And for all practical purposes, for me as a homeowner, for me as a person with a various set of devices that I can carry around in my pocket, those energy sources are inexhaustible. I don't need to worry about replenishing them. Okay, so that's over there. And the reason I want to make a big deal about this is because in some ways, I mean, the reason that I personally am excited about this part of the course is that there's something about the magic wand of, oh, and then ATP is consumed. And it comes across in a way as a magic wand. And I want to understand, what do I mean by that magic wand, in the same way that I can say, oh, you just plug in a battery and then it works. Christmas morning, there's a toy and you plug in the battery and it works. And so let's start with the left-hand column, where we think about the most preeminent of the biological batteries, which is the sun. So the sun, for our purposes, for my purposes, the way I want to think of it is that it's a constant flux. I'm not going to worry about night and day. I'm just going to imagine that raining down upon the earth is radiation with a power of 1,000 watts per square meter. And you can work out. We know what the spectrum is, the black body spectrum, or we know what I don't want to care at all about the absorption of sunlight by different molecules in the atmosphere and so on. But there's some spectrum of energy as a function of wavelength, and that light arrives and it can do stuff. And for our purposes, the over there is the sun. There's fusion reactions taking place 150 million kilometers away, and whatever. That's the concern of the astrophysicist, to figure out how that object works. I don't really mean that because, of course, I'm very interested in that. But for our purposes, we just have a bunch of E equals H news, as I show you here in this position right here. So the idea is that there are photons. These photons arrive, and there are converters. So in this case, the converter is the the thylakoid membranes, which are decorated with various proteins. The proteins are excited by light. That excitation leads to a variety of reactions, which for our purposes, we're just going to say it's a black box, and what it spits out on the other side is polysaccharides. And just as a little aside, just to make sure that we think this through, the energy associated with one of these photons is h nu, where h is Planck's constant. And, I think we should marvel that Planck's constant shows up in so many different scenarios. It was first introduced in the context of black body radiation, but, it shows up in the expression for the energy levels of an atom. It shows up in the specific heat of solids. It shows up here in the energy of photon. I can also rewrite this as hc over lambda, where c is the speed of light, and I can just plug in some numbers here. 6 times 10 to the minus 34 joule seconds is Planck's constant, roughly. The speed of light is 3 times 10 to the 8th meters per second, and then I'm just, because I want to make the math easy for myself, let's choose 600 nanometers as the length of the light that we're thinking about. And so this ends up delivering for me, let's see, the 6's cancel, and I'm left with 3 times 10 to the, so I have minus 34, and then plus 15, so 3 times 10 to the minus 19 joules, and then times 1 kBT is 4 times 10 to the minus 21 joules. And so what we see is, something like 3/4 times 10 to the 2 kTs. So, I loosely referred to that up here as 100 kT, as you can see. Okay, so, maybe we'll talk about it later in the course. Maybe we won't. If you're looking at physical biology of the cell, chapter 18 is the part of our book in which we talk about H-bar physics. In other words, much of the book does not acknowledge the fact that there is something called quantum physics, and clearly that's not entirely right. And so chapter 18 talks about vision. It also talks about photosynthesis. And what I would say is that, if you're interested in the reactions, I think there's very deep and interesting things to think about electron transfer and so on. But for our purposes, the outcome of that process is that we now have a new energy currency. So we have a new battery. The battery in this case is a polysaccharide. So I'm thinking of, a collection of glucose molecules. And those glucose molecules, under combustion, release a huge amount of energy. And probably some of you know this, certainly way better than I do. But, the kind of energy scale here is that you consume one sugar molecule, and out of that you get more than 30 ATPs if done in the presence of oxygen. I don't remember the details, but, it's a lot of energy stored in these sugar molecules. So, you have a cow. The cow eats some of these polysaccharides, and then the powerhouses, the factories of the cell, what they do is through the glycolysis pathway, for example, they produce various molecular intermediates, but another outcome of this is that a new type of biological battery is produced. And that biological battery now is the presence of a concentration gradient. The concentration gradient could be of charged particles, or is of charged particles, and that means that there is a proton motive force. When I say those words, and I'm going to do a separate vignette on that, so I'm not going to show you where this equation comes from, but note, what this equation basically says is that the delta G stored in that new battery is built of two pieces. One is the Q delta V, that's basically the electrical potential energy of having a charge separation. And then the other piece, this kBT log C in over C out, is a statement about the change in entropy when we basically segregate molecules and increase their concentration. There is a cost to doing that. There's a cost because we've decreased the entropy, and so that gradient can be harvested to lift a weight, as I will show elsewhere. And so this concentration gradient is a new form of battery. And as I was saying before, there's a certain universality to a battery. There's a universality to an electrical socket, and there's a universality to a concentration gradient. There's many, many different ways that can be exploited, and we will talk about some of them. And my point here is just to say, one of the ways that is exploited is in the process of ATP synthesis. The ATP synthases rotate at some huge rate, 6,000 RPMs, divide 6,000 RPMs, are converted into per second. So that gives you around 100 hertz. So this thing is rotating 100 times per second. And 3 ATPs, if I remember correctly, are being produced for every such rotation. So it's spinning out a huge number of ATPs every second. So that's now a new energy currency. So that energy currency you can think of as being an input into a variety of other processes. And here too, we'll talk about the significance of the cell maintaining an out of equilibrium composition of ADP, inorganic phosphate, and ATP. In other words, there is a certain concentration of those three at which you will get nothing out of them. They're in other words, intrinsically, the ATP will not actually undergo the hydrolysis reaction unless we have it intentionally stored out of equilibrium. And in that sense, there's nothing special, I would say, about ATP. I can use any molecule. I could use GFP as my out of equilibrium thing if I wanted to, as long as I set it up in a certain way that there was either a gradient or, if there was some reaction. No, so maybe GFP is not the good example for the reaction. But, any system in which there's an A, a B, and a C, and A and B come together to make C, I can use those as a battery as long as I maintain them in an out of equilibrium state. And we're going to talk about that later when I show you a beautiful little toy model that was developed by Daniel Zuckerman as sort of a pedagogical exercise for us to understand how symporters work. These are transporters that basically transport molecules up. They're pumps that pump one molecule up a gradient because there's a parasitic reaction which has to do with the second molecule going down its gradient. And the net is that the free energy of the world is decreased by virtue of that. So I think that this is the main things that I wanted to say about this so-called biological battery. And I hope that you feel inspired by this. I mean, I'm going to try to actually build this up almost as a little bit of a detective story, but there's really a goal on my part of unity. And again, this is really for me more than the students or anyone else. It's that I have this nagging sense of dissatisfaction with understanding the way energy is transduced in biological systems. And here, I've neglected NADP and other possibilities of energy storage devices in the biological context, but these will suffice for our purposes to understand how it is that a particular universal currency can be sitting there. How it got there is none of our business, and then can be exploited for a whole host of different actions. So, over on the right-hand side, you see we have this ATP that can be used to power myosins in the context of muscles, and then the new currency in that case is that we can lift a weight. So, with my bicep, I can lift a weight, and now that weight is lifted, and I can actually use it to do work, which could include lifting the cow. In other words, there's all these different conversions, and in some sense, they owe their origin fundamentally to the preeminent and sort of primordial biological battery of the sun. I should note, an interesting question in the late 1970s, when life was discovered in the Galapagos Rift at a thermal vent, that does raise the question of a different kind of battery. In other words, no photosynthesis required in order to jumpstart the process of life. And I'm quite curious, like what that would look like here. I've toyed around with it before and haven't really found a story that satisfies me. But you have You have interesting elements available that can participate in electron transfer reactions. There are thermal gradients, there are concentration gradients. How all that gets put together in the sense of biological battery like this vignette would be fun to explore. So that will serve as our jumping off point for now using these biological batteries and seeing how various biological reactions can take place.